Hello, everyone, and welcome to Azure Management Talk series. My name is Samir, and in this series, we are meeting with all Azure MVPs and influencers around the world, and just basically talking with them all about Azure management. Today, we are joined by Azure MVP, a long-standing Azure MVP and RD, Maarten Goet, who's going to tell us about the 8 easy steps to improve your security posture in Azure. So let's just get straight into it. I will hand it over to you then, Maarten.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Samir. And thank you to Squared Up for inviting me. And like you said, today's topic is really about 8 easy steps to improve your security posture in Azure, which is, of course, something that a lot of people are interested in as we all move into some sort of use of the public cloud, whether it's native or in a hybrid scenario. And like Samir said, I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been an MVP since 2007. First MOM, Operations Manager, then System Center Operations Manager, Cloud and Data Center. And nowadays I'm an Azure MVP. And I'm also a Regional Director, which is a community title much like MVP, but specifically around strategic and tactically working with both customers and Microsoft on various topics, in my case about security. And I'm also a pilot, so I try and fly the real cloud and the founder of Experts Live. And Samir and I just discussed that we're all longing and in need of a physical conference, but that will not happen probably this year, but somewhere later. So it's great that we can use these types of webinars to inform you on all of the stuff we're excited about. So let's take a step back for a second and consider the world we need to defend. Over the past years, we saw that things were very much still on-premise. We had data centers either at our offices or at a hosting party, and you had your servers and workloads there. You had your Active Directory and the networking equipment connecting it back to your office or home location. And typically, the defenses would be centered around the network part, so adding in firewall or securing it through ports. Making sure that people don't get in, and you're fencing off almost your VMs, your servers, and your data center. Now, in the cloud, that's slightly different because you'll have different types of services. For instance, the Azure-based services like the PaaS and SaaS services. But typically, you also see a different way of connecting. Some of these services might be published directly to the internet. Some will have hybrid connections. Some will have internal VNet. So just taking a network-based approach might not be sufficient. You need to look at things like management portals and other ways to make sure that you are safe in this new cloud and hybrid world. So if you compare both, you might see that where I'm considering to protect a server on-prem, that you're now trying to figure out how to protect a service in the cloud. Same goes for domains. We need to have a look at the subscription and how to protect those. And the domain admin or enterprise admin being the highest privileged user in your Active Directory, you now see on and in cloud the fact that subscription and tenant admins and owners are the ones you worry about, and the credentials you certainly don't want to have stolen or hacked. Past the hash would be credential pivots. Private IPs are now largely public IPs that we need to protect. ACLs become network security groups, and port access now become things like management APIs and other pivot planes. So the cloud defender mindset is something where we need to figure out how to defend those new types of services. Now, tip 1 would be consider to restrict access to your resources. And interesting enough is that if you are using Azure-based services, there's a lot of things you can do. Don't just accept the default ports to be opened. That's, of course, lesson 1, because brute forcing of passwords is real. The second you put a service online, you'll see sweeping IP ranges trying to get in with all sorts of dictionaries. So this is not something you will become more safe from. Consider just-in-time access, or JIT for the acronym. What you get with JIT is that you request to open a specific port for a specific duration and IP address, and after that period, you will actually the port will close and it will no longer be available. And the great thing is that JIT is part of Azure Defender, which is part of Azure Security Center. So this is something you can implement by having a look at Azure Security Center. Now, if we're still looking at the network-based offerings that the platform provides you, there are a lot of options that you can look at in the platform. Of course, the low-hanging fruit are things like VNets, network security groups that you probably already found out about. But there's new types of services like Azure Front Door, the Azure Web Application Firewall, and the Azure Firewall itself, which since Ignite now has a premium option. And these are things you can put in front of certain infrastructure parts in Azure, or combine and mix and mode those in between. But if you're already strong on a certain vendor on premises or at another cloud, then of course Azure also provides you with virtual appliances so that you can connect these into a bigger management story and security story. So begin with the basics and have a look at Azure Networking, of course, and there's a lot of options in the platform. Now, if you need administrative access to your VMs, then have a look at Azure Bastion. Azure Bastion is a fully managed PaaS service. So it's something you can take from Microsoft Azure. And what it provides you is secure SSH and RDP access. So if you're in need to get screen control or need terminal control, this is something you can do. Bastion itself is then provisioned in a VNet where these resources live, and then supports connectivity to those VMs using SSL as the method. And the good thing is that Bastion itself only needs one public IP address to the internet. So these resources are not exposed directly from an administrative workstation. You connect into Bastion and then get an SSL connection into those terminals or screens. And Azure Bastion is something I would recommend for everybody if you're trying to get administrative access to your resources. The second tip, of course, is secure your identity. Still today in 2021, very, very important, because Azure Active Directory is the heart of all of the things you'll be doing, and identity is effectively the new control plane. This controls who has access where. And so like you did on premises with Active Directory for Windows, you need to figure out a security and management story for Azure Active Directory. So any good security strategy has a solution for Azure AD. It's important because likely in a hybrid scenario, you're connecting this up to your on-prem, you'll have an hybrid AD. And so when an attacker gets credentials on-prem, potentially they can pivot into your cloud service and vice versa. And we saw in December last that with the SolarWinds attack, they actually pivoted through the on-prem ADFS into the public cloud and could laterally move there. So attack pivots are real and something to consider. And attacks on identity are accelerating because still not everybody has MFA enabled. People still use weak passwords or reuse passwords, and those things are really bad, so you need a security story. And if you look at the statistics, 60% of cyber attacks start with an identity compromise. So not something to just consider lightly, but have something as part of your security story. Now, when we say identity under constant attack, you see that there were about 3 years ago, a lot of attacks that did the breach replay, about 4.6 billion. And each day, 300 million login attempts go by, financially motivated groups like criminal actors or hackers. And alone in 1 month, April 2018, you saw 350,000 password spray attacks attempted. And by this time, it will probably likely be exploded. And the same goes for risk events, risky sign-ins. 23 million just in 1 month alone. Can you imagine what is happening today? So Microsoft provides something that's called Azure AD Identity Protection. And that gives you automated detection and remediation of identity-based risks. That is machine learning that it then uses to find patterns for your environment, for your users, for your locations, etc. but that is combined with the insights and learnings Microsoft has from their Threat Intelligence Center, MISTIC, M-S-T-I-C. MISTIC works out of a lot of locations in the world and chases all sorts of information from Microsoft's platform by itself, but also, for instance, on nation state stuff. So combining that together with machine learning gives you a lot of insight in the potential attack vectors happening for your tenant. Now, Azure AD IP, Identity Protection, is part of AAD. So it's something you can enable depending on the licensing, of course. And interestingly enough, these signals you get from identity protection can also be fed into conditional access or fed into Azure Sentinel. So it just helps with protecting your identities, but also gives you a bigger picture if you'll be using use cases, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, Microsoft analyzes 6.5 trillion signals a day. So I would urge and make the story that they have a lot of insights that you won't be able to replicate easy yourself. Now, there's another identity piece that could potentially help you. That's called Privileged Identity Management, PIM. And what it means is that I have potentially access to a role, but I need to request access with a certain justification and with a certain duration to that resource or other resources or roles. And depending on approval or the situation, I can actually then start using that role. And afterwards, it gets stripped back from my regular user account again before anything could happen. So it's an as-needed access, no permanent assignments, and part of certain licensing scheme, so something to consider. And the eligible users could require things like approval and reason, but also require MFA. So even if you're single sign-on to the browser or wherever, then still accessing the role would require a mandatory MFA approval to again assure that it's you that's behind the keyboard. And the great thing is all of these actions are then audited and alerted on use. Again, something you can use in your SIEM, be it Azure Sentinel or any other. Okay, tip 3, understand your current status. If you don't know what you have, you will likely not be able to protect it. So with this Cloud Defender mindset, we saw that visibility into your environment is quite necessary because 68% of breaches take months or longer to discover because you're just lacking insights. And 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, Microsoft saw a 95% increase in cost of the breach, now averaging $5.1 million for a US company. So time to respond and making sure that this is something we are on is very important. And the increase, of course, in number and sophistication of attacks. So many numbers, but again, everybody feels the priority and the urgency, I would say. So enter stage Azure Security Center. It has a couple of goals. One is to protect your workloads. And today that's called Azure Defender as part of ASC, where an endpoint gets technology installed so that the endpoint is secured. Whenever somebody tries to breach it or tries to compromise it, Azure Defender will step in and prevent. The other part to Azure Security Center is providing you with those insights, something like the Secure Score, for instance, but also giving you insights on which recommendations you could apply based on security frameworks like CIS or NIST or some of the other important ones. And the great thing is there is a free tier. If you want to start, you can use the free tier and not have to pay anything yet. Some of the functionality like JIT, for instance, is part of the paid tier. But you could differentiate between, for instance, subscriptions, whether or not to go with the paid tier. And all of these recommendations are then into Azure Security Center, consolidated into one view. Also then provided with remediations and one-click fixes if you want to remediate certain things that ASC found. And again, Azure Defender is part of this story. Now, this is important because the cloud environment is changing, maybe not every hour, but certainly almost every day. maybe a new machine gets provisioned, a new service, new containers, new other things. And from minute one, you want to have protections on them, again, because there will be sweeping IP ranges trying to hack you and find vulnerable resources. So with this changing environment, making sure that Azure Security Center is on top of things is important, because then even new machines or insecure subnets, unencrypted SQL servers, all of these things that might be spun up in your environment get instant protection from day one. This is an example dashboard where it's consolidated. So this view also gives you information that this is not only IaaS, but certainly also PaaS. So Kubernetes clusters, containers, key vaults, all of these great things are then protected by Azure Defender, but also you get insights based on the dashboard. Tip 4, dive deeper into your environment. So John Lambert, who is a principal at Mystic, Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center, has a famous quote called, "Defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. As long as this is true, attackers win." And what he means to say is that it's a hard thing to go to 100% protection state. You might miss out on resources, environments are changing, and that will be a hard feat to get done. If you look at the attacking mindset, these hackers and adversaries are trying to find the shortest route to victory, I would say. If they're trying to compromise a high privilege credential, if they're trying to steal a certain IP, then they're trying to find the shortest way of resistance into those things. And wouldn't it be great if we knew the same information, like through which workstation, which server, which resource can I pivot ultimately into those situations? So one of the tips would be is have a look at an open source tool called Bloodhound. It's freely available and built and maintained by a great company called SpectreOps. And what it does, it uses a graph-based instruction to reveal hidden and unintended relationships within Azure AD. And it does so twofold. It has a data collector. You could run a PowerShell script or an executable, and it would collect information from your on-prem AD or your Azure AD or both. And it then takes the visualizer and starts drawing graphs and connections and relationships. And it's built on top of a Neo4j database, which means that even if I'm not using their visualizer, I could still programmatically, through database queries, work with that data and then get a picture displaying all of the relationships. Now, the Azure Hound is the PowerShell module. It collects data from all tenants and subscriptions, wherever you have the rights, and then outputs that in a zip file. And then SharpHound is the file called to visualize. To give you an understanding, about 100K user environment takes about 60 minutes to collect. And then it discovers things like tenants, Azure users, Azure security groups, apps, service principals. Well, you could see the list here. All of these things are then enumerated in your environment. And you get graphs like these. So on the right, you see the directory, you see the principals that have high impact. You see all of the connections, all of the groups they're related to, and you can actually do search queries and start to find the shortest way to those principals, and those might need things like privileged identity management, or those resources might need extra defenses or maybe extra monitoring and logging. And interesting enough is you could just click a resource, say shortest path here, and then it will give you that information. So think in graphs, think in relationships, and try and protect those first as if they are your crown jewels, and then start working your way down will probably be a quite effective approach. Tip 5, implement EDR on your workloads, endpoint detection and response, which is different than antivirus. EDR is not antivirus, it builds on top of AV. With AV, we're protecting the known knowns. We have signature heuristics for the things that were already detected in the past, and AV blocks those, and that's fine. It's still something we need, don't get me wrong. But EDR works on top of that or in conjunction, in harmony with. And it looks at the known unknowns. So the patterns we know that attackers use, that we find as if in your environment, as they move, as they do their initial compromise, we see them using certain apps in a certain way, in certain patterns, and that is something that an EDR starts detecting and now blocking, and that's Microsoft Defender. Microsoft Defender for endpoints, for instance. It's part of the Azure Defender rollout. So if you have VMs, for instance, in Azure, onboarding them to an Azure Defender will give you EDR coverage. And Microsoft Defender provides you with a centralized console and something that's called the Custo Querying Language, KQL, for advanced hunting. So KQL will then give you the flexibility to find things that you might not have found before when you go hunting. Microsoft Defender not only has the next generation protection, it also has threat and vulnerability management, providing you with information on the apps that are installed in your environment, the versions, the CVEs that are known, and the things that you might want to patch and upgrade from an app perspective. It can help you implement the ASR rules, the attack surface reduction rules, making sure that, for instance, macros are not allowed from Office documents anymore, or WMI, PowerShell from macros, all sorts of stuff that you might want to block because it's maybe non-typical work for your Office environment. It also has investigation capabilities. So with the live response, I can remote into a machine, grab the files that it's hinting about, maybe run commands, maybe isolate the machine while still communicating with the machine. But also things like Microsoft Threat Experts or your own SOC as a service, where it's allowing you to hook in a third party with expertise. It's embedded into OS if you look at Windows. Certainly for the older versions, there's backward compatibility, but it's also there for Mac, Apple Mac. It's also for Android, iOS, and Linux. So it's pretty far-fetching. This is, for instance, an example from the new Microsoft Defender 365, security.microsoft.com, the unified portal, where it's taking information from mailboxes, from endpoints, from your identities, and combining them into a logical attack story, allowing you to easily investigate what's going on in your environment. All right, tip 6, set up security monitoring, because once you know what you have, you might want to track down what's happening in your environment. And Microsoft Defender is one piece of it, of course, allowing you to defend your endpoints. But Azure Sentinel is the second piece to it, your cloud-native SIEM that then combines all of these signals into a bigger story, also with information from other clouds. Now, Azure Sentinel has been there for 1.5 years, available as a service in Azure, and it provides you with limitless cloud speed and scale. And scale you could probably already imagine because you'll have a bit of storage with all of those signals and events coming in. But certainly speed is important, because if you're doing machine learning, for instance, you need bursts of compute capacity, but that same capacity won't be needed all day. So scaling up and down is something that Azure then helps you do with Sentinel. Machine learning is built in, something we call Azure Sentinel Fusion. And so some of these patterns are then based on behavior specifically for your environment, your users. And connecting up your Office 365, your Azure resources is easy through connectors, but there's over 100 connectors now, also from competing products like AWS, GCP, your networking equipment, pretty much everything at this point. And it being a cloud service, you just pay for what you use, which is always good fun instead of big investments up front for storage and compute. Here's an impression of some of the connectors. Again, competing products, Microsoft products, some general connectors like syslog, Ceph, Windows events, Linux events, ODD, Logstash. I could go on and on. So I've not found one situation for data I couldn't hook up into Azure Sentinel, but go have a look in Azure Sentinel itself for all the connectors it provides. Because it also connects AWS, GCP, and Oracle, You get one SIEM for all your clouds. So if you want to monitor credential abuse, that can actually be combined with Azure AD together with your AWS IAM to give you a better and bigger story on anything happening across clouds. So do consider Azure Sentinel for that as well. There's a great investigation UI I'll show you in a second in the demo, where you can actually visualize the attack happening, get more information on a specific step, and zoom in and find any relating alerts or steps happening. All right, tip 7, think use cases, not just alerts. And let me explain. If you get a signal alert, in this case, an unusual sign-in activity, you might be chasing your tail because you'll get a couple of them during the day. Maybe somebody is indeed traveling from a home to an office location. Maybe somebody's underway. Somebody enabled their VPN deliberately or by mistake. Maybe if travel opens, will be in another country. So these unusual sign-in activities are quite common. And for your SOC, your Security Operations Center, it will be a big task to make sure we clear them all and make sure there's not one rogue alert. And this is tough. So one signal is tough to follow. So let me give you an example of a use case where we say at 9:13, we actually find an unusual login from Indonesia, which could be true or false positive. We typically don't know, spend a lot of time. But what if we find at the same moment an anonymous IP, let's say Tor exit, in that same region for that same user and that same IP address? Then you already have 2 data points alerting you. We see about half an hour later a potential suspicious PowerShell script being executed from that endpoint where that user is logged in. And about 8 minutes later, we see an inbox forwarding rule and data now exfiltrated from our office location and our cloud into adversaries' storage location. Combining these 4 signals, of course, gives us quite a high confidence that this is wrongdoing, and this is something that's a high priority problem to investigate. So combining alerts 2 or more into a use case is really, really important, and this is the strength of Azure Sentinel, allowing you to combine those signals into one bigger story. And here's an example of a compromised account leading to Office 365 mailbox exfiltration with the corresponding alerts that you can then click into and zoom into. If you need more information, then again, with KQL, the Kusta query language, you could still go hunting, do deep investigations, maybe tailor the use case to your environment, or use it to your benefit. And one of the things I'd love to point out to you is a PowerShell module called AzSentinel, built by our great friend Pooyan Kabazi, also an MVP, that has built a PowerShell module that allows you to automate a lot of these things. Like if you are automating use cases, if you need to automate the deployment, then have a look at AzSentinel. All right, 8th and final tip, apply security anywhere or everywhere with Arc, Azure Arc. If you've not heard about Azure Arc yet, also have a look at the Microsoft Ignite sessions that are now available for replay. But Azure Arc allows you to attach to existing Windows, Linux, and Kubernetes resources, manage them as any other Azure-based resource, and use ARM or Bicep, etc., to do any automation or any connection you would normally do, essentially allowing you to have one control plane to rule all your clouds. And because there's Azure Arc for servers, you could do that on physical or VMs. Azure Arc for Kubernetes clusters, something that helps you manage those AKS and non-AKS clusters, and also the data servers on Azure Arc. Will then allow you to combine Azure Defender with Azure Arc, enforce compliance and simplify auditing on those resources, manage it from the same portal you just saw, view and remediate it, and get a multi-cloud security protection in the sense that it spans now into your data center of that of your hoster or any other environment. For instance, if you're running Kubernetes clusters in AWS, Azure Arc would be a great choice. Conclusion, Azure provides you with a lot of security controls, both for identity and access management, for networking, data security, threat protection, and of course, security management. And make no mistake, is something that Forrester already said 2 years ago. Microsoft is a security company now, and they're investing a lot of time, money, and people into getting this right. And they're actually de facto one of the leaders for the products they're providing with you. Now, if you're interested in things like Azure Sentinel, go have a look at wortel.nl. You'll find a free ebook, about 100 pages on everything Azure Sentinel, free for you to use and download. And if you want to stay up to date with me, have a look at maartengoed.org. I blog quite regularly on all sorts of stuff on Azure security, but I also have a podcast called securityinsiders.io, and it's available on your favorite podcast app. And I'm talking to all sorts of great people about Azure and non-Azure security. Okay. Samir.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I think it was so good that nobody has any questions because you managed to convince us all. Awesome. Thank you so much, Maarten. Really appreciate your time.
Happy to do.
Yeah. Okay, so unless anybody has any questions, let's give it a couple of minutes and see if there are any questions that pop up. Do you have any other closing thoughts, Maarten?
No, I would say that there's a lot of stuff they can do today. So like with Azure Security Center free, with some of these free connectors for Azure Sentinel, I think spending some of your time and energy in the coming days and weeks on working on security for your environment is important. And then, make sure that you get a safer environment. But consider it as something that's quite important, not just build and maintain infrastructure, but also secure it, of course.
Yeah. Okay, still no questions, so I think let's wrap it up for today. Thanks again, everyone, for joining the webinar today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The recording of this webinar will be shared to you by next week, hopefully. There is one last webinar to go in the series, which is about Azure Resource Graph going from zero to hero, and it is being presented by the Microsoft consultant Billy York. And it will be hosted on Thursday, the 11th. Thanks again for joining, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks, Maarten. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Samir.
Cheers. Bye-bye.